Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for this webinar. We just give a minute to allow more people join in. Yeah, we'll probably just wait for 1 minute. Before we start, just some housekeeping things. So this session will be recorded and will be available later on the Temple's YouTube channel. And for all the participants, please mute yourself during the presentation. So our program today is we have probably about 40 minutes presentation, then 20 minutes Q&A. So by all means, pop your questions or comments in the chat box or the Q&A part of this session. As well as you're very welcome to unmute yourself, raise your hand during the Q&A session as well, raise a question verbally too. So without further ado, we'll get started. Thank you very much for joining us today at this webinar. Today, we are going to discuss climate resilience and net zero, particularly on adaptation, mitigation, and reporting. My name is Shang Shen. I'm a senior director at Temple. So can I give you a brief introduction of who we are? Temple is a leading independent environmental and planning consultancy. We're guided by our purpose and sustainability strategy. It's fair to say our sustainability strategy is embedded in everything we do in our services. So what is our purpose? Our purpose is to make meaningful environmental and social differences together. Our purpose is our identity as an organization. So this is further being practiced as well as embedded in our daily kind of working life. Without going into too much details, I would suggest you have a look on Temple's website, Sustainability Impact Report. You can download that to view more details. You probably noticed we also have a B Corp logo on the slides. So Temple is a certified B Corp. We're recognized as an impactful business, which means we meet highest standards of social and environmental performances. In addition to that, Temple is a proud member of IEMA Quality Mark. We are committed to share our EIA knowledge. This webinar is part of that. We continue to improve our practice and enhance the quality of our delivery. So in terms of our services, we cover a multidisciplinary offering from planning to environmental impact assessment, from ecology, which including arboriculture as well as biodiversity netting, as well as lots of service, and to social economics, social value, health impact assessment, ESG, noise acoustics, air quality. We had a webinar last week. Our climate carbon services are the focus of today. So in terms of climate and carbon and sustainability, in fact, this is actually a quite wide range of topics because we really have to looking at them in the context. So we do climate risk assessment, adaptation plans, decarbonization plans, net zero strategy, whole life carbon assessment. This is relating to either at a project level, for example, the railway projects, highways, and so on, but also at a city or region level in terms of the strategy, as well as at organizational level in terms of corporate sustainability reporting and ESG. So we also have a very strong training and capacity building capability, which we have carried out various training work for local authorities in the past. Without further ado, I would like to introduce my colleagues Jessica and Steve, who will run through the climate resilience, adaptation, mitigation, as well as reporting today. Over to you, Jess.
Thanks, Sharon. Thanks everyone for joining. My name is Jessica, and in this webinar we are going to, as Sharon said, cover the climate legislation and drivers, what are the risks and opportunities, and how do we mitigate these and address these for climate adaptation and carbon management. And then we'll finish up with a Q&A at the end. So I think first we'll just start with a quick poll just so that we can understand the background of the audience. So very briefly, if you can add into the chat, what is your area of work? And then also what is your level of understanding of climate adaptation and mitigation? So it just has to be very brief, but we can just use these later to understand the audience. So I'll just proceed whilst that is happening. So first of all, just to kind of introduce everything, what is adaptation and mitigation? So climate adaptation relates to actions that protect us against the impacts of climate change. And this includes reacting to the changes we have seen already, as well as preparing for what will happen in the future. And then climate mitigation relates to actions that avoid and reduce the carbon emissions. So we need to be addressing it from both of these different angles to foresee the overall risk of climate change. So we know that the UK and the world is experiencing the impacts of climate change, and this has fueled many drivers for the needs to address this. Some of the key drivers include changing weather patterns, legislation, stakeholder pressure, and economic losses. And I'm just going to touch on a few in the next few slides. So coming on to one of the key drivers, obviously changes in climate and increase in extreme weather events are very prevalent in the UK and globally now. We know that the UK is predicted to have warmer, wetter winters and hotter, drier summers with key risks such as flooding, heat wave storms and droughts. And now these two examples here just illustrate some of the weather events which the UK has experienced in the last few years. So thinking about this one in summer 2022 with a heat wave with record-breaking temperatures, it was the first ever level 4 heat health alert, and then also 3,000 excess deaths in England were predicted as a cause of this heat wave. And then much more recently, we have Storm Dara happening in 2024, where there was red warnings for flooding, but also storms. 200,000 homes lost power and there was 3 deaths. And these are just a sample of the types of events that we are going to be experiencing more and more. And this quote here from the bottom is from the Climate Change Risk Assessment Report. And this is a government report which is produced every 5 years that it assesses the adaptation measures that the government needs to carry out at a national scale. And they predicted that economic damages could exceed £1 billion per year by 2050. So that just illustrates the extent of the economic losses as well associated with these changes in weather. Another key driver is legislation. So this slide focuses on the climate adaptation legislation and guidance. As I just mentioned, the UK Climate Change Risk Assessment every 5 years sets out how they're planning to address these adaptation risks. And essentially the outcomes of this report can affect how infrastructure projects are carried out based on the commitments from the government. So, for example, they committed that they're going to invest more in flood defences, so there should be more infrastructure projects in flood defences Another key one is the environmental impact assessment regulations. So these mandate a project to assess the impact of climate. So looking more at the greenhouse gas emissions, but then also the vulnerability of the project to climate change. And we can see that there's been an upward trend in standalone climate change EAA chapters, which is just emphasizing the importance of this going forward. There's also the National Planning Policy Framework. So this has been recently updated in December 2024. And in the update, there's an increased emphasis on embedding climate resilience into planning. So applications now have to address a full range of potential climate change impacts. This is kind of including stuff I've already mentioned, such as overheating, storms, floods, water scarcity, and they have to demonstrate that they are putting measures in place to address those risks. And then more at the local authority level. So a lot of local authorities now have their standalone planning requirements that projects will need to abide by. And many of these now require climate change risk assessments and adaptation planning as key documents for submission. So on the carbon side of the legislation, there's been some key changes this last year with the UK committing at COP29 to reducing emissions by 81% by the year 2035. And this is in comparison to 1990 levels. Now, this is an update from the previous target of 78%. And as part of this target update, they included new targets for sectors such as the built environment. So that has included a 70% reduction by 2030 in carbon, energy sector with an accelerated phase out of fossil fuels, and in the transport sector, they're mandating EV as a requirement going forward with stage targets. Coming down more to the local level as well. So the Greater London Authority has mandatory requirements for new schemes to assess their carbon implications. And this includes carrying out documents such as a whole life carbon assessment, but also circular economy statement. So now that we understand some of the key drivers, both at a national but also at a local level, we'll move on to touch on some of the real risks and opportunities of climate change. So the physical impacts of climate change, as I've previously discussed, result in disruption and loss of infrastructure services. And then this can lead to loss of life and health issues from these impacts, as well as increasing costs from maintaining or replacing assets following climate events. And there's also increased carbon emissions associated with the rebuilding and repairing of infrastructure if these cycles become smaller and smaller in the maintenance cycles. There are also complex and cascading risks across multiple networks and sectors because there's many interdependencies between infrastructure systems. So this can include risks to do with access to water, energy, transport, and also raw materials. So the supply chain is very long for infrastructure systems. So that's why adaptive plans and carbon management plans need to be put in place to safeguard against these risks. As mentioned, there is also an increasing requirement in the UK to address climate change. So projects and businesses need to start to embed this into processes to meet regulations and avoid any actions to do with liability. We know that there's also increasing scrutiny in projects around sustainability, and if not addressed correctly, it can negatively affect reputation, which can lead to difficulties in attracting new clients and investments at that level. So a lot of these can be turned into opportunities. So one of the first ones is leading to new business opportunities. As I've just mentioned, sustainability is becoming a key selling point. So many government bodies and investors are prioritizing projects with stronger sustainability credentials. It also gives businesses and projects a chance to invest in new innovations and technology to help improve efficiency and also to give a competitive edge. Addressing carbon emissions also and responding to climate adaptation has co-benefits. So this is things like improving resource efficiency. We can incorporate nature-based solutions into projects and schemes and also reduce air and water pollution as a result of addressing these overall risks. And then obviously these can lead to improved social and environmental outcomes whilst also making projects and businesses able to meet their other environmental targets. So through careful planning, projects and businesses can also proactively identify risks which can lead to projected overall cost saving. And this is also to do with improvement in your management and processes, your reduced maintenance and operation costs, and also resource efficiency. So there's kind of long-term planning there, which can help to reduce those savings. It's been known that infrastructure that is designed with both low carbon emissions and climate resilience in mind tends to have a longer lifespan, reduced repair costs, and also less vulnerability to disruptions. And these things can then secure that long-term project stability and security, which a lot of investors look for. And then kind of the overall picture of this is demonstrating a commitment to sustainability can improve reputation amongst stakeholders and improve business resilience. So how do we actually mitigate these risks in practice? So I'm going to touch on the principles of climate resilience and adaptation from a methodology perspective. So these are the key principles of climate adaptation that we apply to other projects at Temple, and this follows best practice, guidance, and also the regulations posed for different project levels and stages. So this is an iterative process, and it should be carried out on a cyclical basis to understand the dynamic risks from climate change. And this graphic on the right here illustrates that kind of cyclical process that this assessment needs to take. So the first step is to carry out climate modeling, and this is to establish your current and future climate conditions. And to do this, we utilize the Met Office climate projections, looking at flood maps, and then identifying the related climate hazards that come off the back of this. So this is things like flooding and drought and heat waves. Once we have our climate hazards that are specific to that project, we will identify the key receptors. So once we have our receptors, we can look at the specific vulnerability and risks to those climate hazards. And then off the back of this, we can identify the key impacts that this can have both in the short term and the long term for that specific receptor, but also for the project overall. Then we can look to develop the adaptation measures, and it's important that adaptation measures are practical, economical, and proportional to the project or the business. So if they are all these three things, then it is easier to integrate them into long-term planning and design. A key thing as well is to prioritize these measures to assess which ones need to be done now and which ones can be done later. And we do this using scenario analysis, looking at different time horizons and different worst case or medium case scenarios based on the project's risk appetite as well. Once you have these adaptation measures, it's important to integrate these into design, operational plans, and also policies to ensure that they are carried out at all different levels within a business or a project. And then the last thing, once these have been implemented, is to evaluate and monitor the outcomes over the lifespan of this. So it's important to implement adaptive management on projects, and this helps to proactively adapt to the evolving climate risks and allow for adjustment in the planning, which means that you can invest at times when you need to invest in certain measures. So this slide just discussed the key reporting mechanisms for assessing climate adaptation risks. So the first one that I've mentioned before is the environmental impact assessment. And this is a methodology which the climate risks are assessed as part of the overall EIA, as part of the chapter of that. And this has robust guidance and regulations that we follow to carry out these types of assessments. Now coming on to the kind of more standalone types of assessments or plans. If a local authority potentially has specific requirements, or a specific project or business might have assets which are of a high risk due to their nature, location, or if they are nationally significant, then a full climate change risk assessment can be carried out, and this can be done at much more in-depth level. Following on from this, you would develop adaptation plans. So this can provide those short-term and long-term plans that can help feed into the project or the business risk and investment planning to consider adaptive management throughout the lifespan of that particular project. So what can you do on your project to adapt? So one of the key things is to consider climate change early in a project. So you can see from the graph down here that it demonstrates that the expected costs for climate risks for adaptation measures are much smaller at the start of an asset life cycle rather than if you try and retrofit these adaptation measures towards the end. So this demonstrates that it is beneficial to consider these early in a project. And this also means that you should also understand the legislation and policy requirements as well, so that you can scope these into the full extent of it early. Another key thing is communication and collaboration. So consulting with suppliers, architects and designers to see how they are considering climate adaptation in their work. And this helps you to be able to communicate with clients or stakeholders why everyone needs to improve climate adaptation to also reduce risks and increase that kind of long-term stability and cost effectiveness throughout the lifespan. So a key thing is that adaptation measures need to be practical, proportional, cost effective, but also impact driven. So measures need to be bespoke for different sectors, and it's not kind of just copy and paste across everything. And these are kind of some examples of different types of adaptation measures that you can look to integrate into specific projects. So there's hard interventions, so this takes the form of building modifications, infrastructure strengthening, and this looks to cover things like flood defences or heat-resistant building design. And a key thing of this is to integrate climate projections into design specifications rather than using past climate data or historical climate data, because that allows you to design for the future. Another type of adaptation measure is you can look to do nature-based solutions. So this is more kind of natural flood management, sustainable urban drainage design, and also looking for tree cover on projects. So this allows projects to see the co-benefits socially and environmentally on a kind of long-term scale. And the last thing is that you can embed this into planning and strategy. So look at your existing policy and procedure, see how you can embed adaptation into that to make it business as usual for projects. So this is a temple that a project that Temple is working on currently. It is the largest fluvial flood scheme in the UK and is a £600 million project being developed to reduce flood risk to around 15,000 properties. So Temple were involved with preparing the climate change EIA chapter, and as part of this, we worked with the design teams to recommend climate change adaptation measures. And some examples of these include sequencing of construction works to enable safe flood response management, because there was lots of flood risk as part of this, both in the construction and operational phase of this project. Another thing was to design for the future, so considering climate projections in the design standards rather than looking to historical climate data or standards. The project can also implement early warning systems. So this helps during the operation, but also the construction phase of the project to monitor those real-time flood conditions, which allows effective flooding protocols, and that the response times can be much shorter. And then another thing is to implement nature-based solutions. So this can help to manage surface water effectively, whilst also integrating those co-benefits as part of other elements of the project. So now I'm just going to pass over to Stephen to discuss on the carbon management side some of the mitigations that you can put in place.
That's great. Thanks very much, Jessica. Yes, I'm Stephen Glennie, a principal consultant as well at Temple. So I'm going to talk about mitigation in terms of carbon management and net zero. The net zero being the goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to as close to zero as possible, and then remove the remaining emissions in some way. So obviously that is critical for mitigating the worst impacts of climate change. And the quicker it can be done, the better, as long as the focus is on reducing emissions. So that should be at least 90% ahead of doing any offsetting, as is required by net zero certification. And then as we talk about carbon management, but really we mean all of the direct greenhouse gases that are covered under the Paris Agreement. So as carbon dioxide is emitted in the largest quantities and is responsible for the majority of global warming, greenhouse gas emissions are converted into carbon dioxide equivalents, and that is generally what we talk about when we're talking about carbon reduction or carbon management. So what are the principles of carbon management? Well, it involves the structured measurement and the managed reduction of carbon emissions, be that for organisations or projects, with some compensation where those reductions are not possible. The first step should be to put a plan in place. There should be a net zero strategy or a carbon reduction, something similar, sort of a plan at an organisational level. And then you need to understand what your emissions are. It's often said you can't manage what you can't measure. So a GHG footprint should be done to gain this understanding. And that should follow a recognised standard and be across all scope 1, 2 emissions and as many of the scope 3 emissions as possible. And again, this can be done for a company or for a project, or for example, for an EIA submission as well. Now, once this footprint has been verified, then hotspots and an action plan can be identified to reduce emissions and use science-based targets. Plans can be made for any future reductions of emissions that it's not possible to reduce at the moment. And then once as much reduction as possible has been identified, an action set, then sequestration or offsetting can be looked at, as long as that is also properly assessed and verified carbon offsets are used, for example. And then that footprinting should be repeated regularly to measure progress. So yeah, carbon management is essential for reducing and mitigating environmental risks and damage, and done properly, as Jessica discussed, it usually involves long-term cost savings, be that through energy and material efficiency and waste reduction, and that work aligns with circular economy thinking. We've also seen that the regulations that are in place around carbon management, from the Paris Agreement to the UK's net zero commitments and mandatory carbon reporting, through to the whole life carbon footprints and circular economy statements that are required in London, and more sector and business specific regulations are on the horizon. There is sort of guidance to help as well. There's, similarly to the adaptation and resilience, there's IEMA guidance on assessing greenhouse gas emissions for EIA as well. But having robust carbon management and net zero commitments will help companies in securing work and positions on frameworks and supply chains in most industries. So in terms of best practice, for best results, a carbon management strategy needs to be comprehensive and have buy-in from the highest levels of an organisation and all levels, really. It's essential that companies and projects understand what carbon emissions they're responsible for and where they come from. So as we've said previously, can be a carbon footprint as a baseline, and then have targets set and a reduction plan following on from that, with that footprinting repeated regularly to measure the progress. So whether that's annually for companies in their reporting, or at key stages for projects such as business case or planning submissions. So the targets that you set for carbon reduction have got to be achievable, but also ambitious. It's important that they're robust, and the best way to do that is to use science-based targets and work with the Science-Based Targets Initiative, because that can help align your targets then with the Paris Agreement goals. So really the aim has got to be to reduce emissions as much as possible, before considering any offsetting. Now, most of the frameworks and guides that are out there, they recognise the importance of engaging stakeholders with carbon management. It's a key part of a strategy being able to deliver what is required of it. It's often best achieved through that regular, transparent, honest reporting that we've talked about. A part of that can be getting independent third-party verification, be that of your carbon footprint, the progress reports, and even the carbon management strategy and plan itself. So as we've touched on, following a widely recognised framework is the best way to realise the benefits and meet those supply chain requirements. One of the most widely recognised standards is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. It was developed in the 1990s and is a widely recognised comprehensive framework for measuring and managing greenhouse gas emissions. There's also ISO 14064, which is a standard for carbon footprinting, gives guidance to organisations on how to quantify, report and also verify their carbon emissions. The standard, it's got a few parts to it. For example, part 3 gives guidance on how to verify greenhouse gas footprints, and that's the standard that Temple follow for the verification work we began back in 2012 for some of our clients. And then within the infrastructure and built environment sectors, PAS 2080, carbon management in buildings and infrastructure is the most widely used and a recognised standard. Talking of PAS 2080, it's something we've written a piece on recently. Mentioned at the top there, but you can find it on our website as well under news and insights. So it's the most relevant framework for the infrastructure and built environment sectors. So first published in 2016, focusing on infrastructure, was then updated in 2023 to cover all of the built environment, and increase the emphasis on whole life carbon and consistency across the sector. So it looks at the whole value chain and aims to reduce cost and carbon, and really it's essential to UK infrastructure as it provides the guiding principles that the DfT use on their programme to decarbonise transport infrastructure in the UK. So all transport infrastructure projects that the DfT fund have to produce a whole life carbon assessment and a carbon management plan in line with PAS 2080, and also use the carbon management hierarchy, which comes from the ability to reduce carbon being greatest early on in a project, as you can see in the graph here, which is taken from the standard. So PAS 2080 is used by all different modes of transport and organisations within, so Network Rail, National Highways, as well as in other infrastructure as well. So the Environment Agency also use it for their flood and coastal resources construction. And benefits of using it are it allows a comparability across projects and programmes, and it gives a consistent approach to delivering and measuring carbon reduction actions. So any companies that want to win and deliver work in these sectors have got to understand and embrace PAS 2080. So that's something Temple can help with. We've got considerable experience working with it for clients such as Network Rail, HS2, National Highways. We've also assessed some of the DfT's portfolio project data, looking at alignment with PAS 2080, and also looking at the National Highways Net Zero plan as well. So part of our experience with the standard also includes our recent 2-year secondment as one of the Environment Agency's national carbon specialists. So EA have a plan to be net zero by 2050, with an interim target of a 45% carbon reduction by 2030. So that's only 5 years away now, and with construction projects making the majority of their carbon footprint, reductions on those were a real focus for them. So in this role, we worked at both the strategic and the project levels, working with the national carbon team to implement that ambitious carbon management process for the construction projects, and based on PAS 2080 principles, where they also using a carbon budget approach to try and manage their trajectory to net zero. And that process is used across their business case approach model for the construction projects. And again, it's got those requirements to use the carbon hierarchy to prioritise greater reduction in the early project stages. For example, modelling and looking at whether natural flood management or no-build solutions can deliver the objectives of the project instead of construction. So Environment Agency developed their own carbon tools for calculating and reporting carbon emissions and the carbon budget for a project. And part of our role was to verify those tools for projects at each of the business case stages to ensure that they were accurate and also that they were delivering the required carbon emissions reductions at each stage. Our work also involved training. That's for the Environment Agency staff and for contractors, both on the process and the tools. And we also held carbon reduction workshops for individual projects and for programs as well, to look at specific emission reduction actions that they could take forwards. So some of the examples that the Environment Agency have undertaken was specifying 100% recycled steel piles, the use of low carbon concrete wherever possible, and also actions like sourcing waste steel from other industries to use on in their projects. So we also just wanted to finish a little bit with a brief summary really of reporting at the organisational level. So as you can see here, and as talked about, there are several drivers in the UK that we've discussed, including Climate Change Act and increased regulatory pressure and requirements for demonstrating reporting around climate adaptation, resilience and mitigation. We've also mentioned that there are expanded mandatory requirements on ESG disclosures and emissions reporting, with more to come potentially this year. The focus of all these is being on transparency, standardised reporting and accountability, and demonstrating that climate change has been integrated into an organisation's vision, decision-making, operations and investments. So that really brings us to the end of our presentation, and I hope you can see from this webinar that the time to take action on climate change, resilience, adaptation, mitigation and reporting is now, and the need will only become more urgent. And I hope you've also seen that these areas all can and need to work together in order to reduce and manage the risks that organisations and projects face as quickly as possible, and that Temple is well placed to help clients with that. So why Temple? As we've discussed here, we can help you in addressing all the risks we've covered and in implementing an integrated approach to climate change mitigation, adaptation and reporting. Temple have a strong and award-winning multidisciplinary team across a wide range of technical environmental services. We've got a large ecology and noise team, specialist air quality planning, EIA, social value, environmental management and consents teams, as well as our climate and carbon team that we've got. That also includes a new international ESG capability. We've also got a long and successful background in the infrastructure and development sectors, and our associate model allows us to put together bespoke teams of specialists to deliver value and expertise on a wide range of projects. So we'll open up the floor now for a little Q&A. Please either post some questions in the Q&A or the chat sections, or unmute yourselves if you'd like to ask them directly. And then if you have any further questions after the event or just want to get in touch, then please contact us at the email address on the screen or through our website. But thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Steve. Yes, any questions? Feel free to pop in the chat box or raise your hand. Yeah, I guess obviously this is a quite we covered quite a lot today. So by all means, if you have any queries or questions, just yeah, just raise your voice, maybe. Let's give people a little bit time, maybe when you consider. Oh, Zen, you have a question?
Yeah, just a quick one. This was mentioned towards, I think, the start of the presentation. To do with the flood defense schemes, I think was mentioned as one of the examples of the kind of projects that was undertaken in response to the UK climate change adaptation program. I was just curious as to whether there were any other kind of examples of infrastructure projects that have been undertaken as a consequence of this, the NAP3 guidance.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. So I can cover this one. So yeah, the example I used was around flood defences, which is obviously a big part of the kind of UK infrastructure future in terms of investment. Some of the other ones that they've committed to as part of that national adaptation plan include things such as a transportation adaptation plan. So this will aim to look at public transportation, so trains and aviation, but also around roads. So how can they adapt at a national level for these different infrastructure elements? They've also made commitments around the built environment. So new residential builds, but also older residential builds, looking to address the risks of overheating and solar gain that is a massive issue in homes. So how can they retrofit older homes, but then incorporate that into new design standards? And they've kind of covered a wide range of other elements to do with nature planning and how can that be designed to be more adaptable for the future, to make sure that species are planted in areas that they will be adaptable to climate change, but then also looking at the social side of things as well. So funding for vulnerable communities around climate change risks and how they can actually be supported through some of those kind of more vulnerable areas. I think that's kind of the key ones, essentially.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thank you.
Thanks, Jess. Debbie, you have a question?
Hello, everyone. Yes, thank you for a very interesting presentation all at Temple. It's good to see that PAS 2080 seems to be gaining a lot more traction since it was revised in 2023, because I think it has a massive role to play in the success of this. But and key clients and supply chain are sort of incorporating it into this scope. But I think it's still very challenging for lots of organisations. So just wondering what you see as maybe the top two challenges and the solutions to those challenges around PAS 2080.
Thank you for that. Yeah, it's a good question. I think, like I said, a lot of people do find it challenging in terms of, yeah, I think that understanding of what it covers and how to really how to integrate it into their operations and onto projects. The top two challenges. I think from the experience we've had working on it, I think some of it is getting that sort of buy-in throughout the projects, whoever's working on it, whether it's people within an organisation or different contractors who may come into the program of works. And I think the key to addressing that and getting the buy-in and understanding from people is sort of setting up that structure and process in the first place, and talking really about the experience we've had with the Environment Agency, by them sort of setting that framework of having tools, ways of reporting sort of set out at the beginning, and then having a kind of training resource as well for the contractors coming into the process. I think that helped to address it a bit. Obviously, there were still real challenges there in getting people to understand the tools that they were completing and understanding the process and what PAS 2080 really means in terms of the different areas for where carbon emissions are and how they're quantified and measured in the different parts of it. But I think even though there were those challenges, I think by the sort of end of the time we'd been there was a lot more understanding around it because of having that sort of process in place for a while and having that structure there that people could, I guess, lean on a little bit and see that these tools are in place and that, you know, there was a resource available to train the contractors and whoever was coming into that process into understanding it a bit. I think that's probably the main bit. I hope that answers it a little bit.
No, thank you, Stephen. Yes, I think obviously the stakeholder engagement is crucial in the process, and depending on the complexity can be more of a challenge. Thank you.
Thanks. Any more questions? Sorry, there's some in the chat. So this is for Mariana. So she said, you mentioned looking at future weather models rather than the current ones. What is your experience with developers and the client regarding this?
Yeah, I can pick this up. Thanks, Marina. So I think a lot of this is already integrated into either regulation but also assessment principles already. So the kind of principles of doing a climate change adaptation assessment is to look at those kind of future projections and to make sure that you are considering that as part of your business planning and investment strategy in that sense. So I think clients who are under those requirements under regulations, that is something that they're already kind of on board with because that is kind of standard practice in that sense. In terms of integrating this into design, so in terms of flooding is a good example of where they have been considering climate change allowances for a long time now. So flood mapping and modeling always uses climate change allowances to then make sure that when we're designing flooding defenses or any sort of measures around that, they are considering future climate events. And I think other elements of design are starting to consider these as well. So, for example, in the energy sector, or even just in the power sector, looking at generators, for example. So generators, if that does not have, if the kind of maximum thresholds for that operation of that generator is, 35 degrees or more, but then what is the frequency of that going to be exceeded with extreme weather or heat waves going into the future? So developers and, technical specialists and people who are looking at technology are starting to think about how the risks of these can be considered as part of design. But it is kind of a slower process than flooding, for example, has been happening for a while. And a lot of these are starting to get embedded into management plans, design standards, and also kind of material selection. So thinking about how they can use more, thinking about biodiversity, more drought effective species of plants at a landscaping level. So they are starting to think about this. Hopefully that answers the question, but feel free to ask any follow-up ones.
Thank you, Jess. Any more questions? In that case, we maybe conclude our session today. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for your questions and your time. By all means, please get in touch with us at the email address as well as our individual LinkedIn and so on. We're here to support you. And also we're here to learn. This sector have lots to learn still. We're here to learn this together too. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So
Okay, well done, everyone.